We have many different quilts, many different designs, patterns at our quilt show today, and I'd like to show you just a few. This quilt back here is a signature quilt. It's the signatures of all the young people who were baptized into the church in 1942, I believe it was. They even have the name of the pastor here who baptized them. That year, the Eden Church had 46 youth baptized into their membership, and this records who they were.
I'm Cheryl Stucky, and my mother, back in 1974, after the Swiss Mennonite Centennial celebration, was inspired to design and make this quilt. She started with tea towel motifs that she had, and then she went searching in magazines and cookbooks in her own memory and creation to create 49 blocks. I helped her with the embroidery of the blocks, but she did all of the quilting. And this was done in about 1975-76.
Every quilt we have here today is special to somebody in some way, and it was hard to decide how to decide which ones to put up because everyone has its special story. This quilt is an excellent example of an applique quilt. It was a famous pattern, probably in the 30s or 40s. It happened to be my aunt who did this. She put it together in 1939 before she was married, probably to start collecting things for her household. This quilt is an example of applique. It's appliqued and pieced and embroidered, all three. These were vintage blocks that were sewn in the 1940s probably and came to me as blocks. I put them together in a quilt in the 2000s, many years later, using vintage fabric that matched the fabric on the girls' dresses. This is a quilt I love because of the colors and the way they come together. It is pieced just out of tiny squares, but the design they make is extraordinary. It is hand quilted by a mother for her daughter before she got married in 1935. This quilt is really special. It's the only one we have of this kind. It was made out of upholstery fabric and probably pieces that came out of an upholstery fabric book. It came from Ohio from years ago, and as you can see, has been used a lot and loved. We like to use quilts to celebrate holidays. This is a whimsical quilt made for Halloween. If you look closely, you can see that all the witches are actually sitting on their brooms as they're flying through the night. We use quilts to celebrate all kinds of milestones in our lives, I guess. This is a special quilt because it was used to celebrate Y2K, the year 2000, moving into a new millennium. The requirements for a Y2K quilt were that you had to put 2,000 pieces in the quilt, and every piece had to be from a separate piece of fabric. So for the quilters who didn't have 2,000 pieces at home, there was a trading post online where you could trade 20 pieces of your fabric with 20 pieces of somebody else's fabric. That way you could accumulate your 2,000 pieces and put them in a design of your own to make your Y2K quilt.
We gave my daughter an embroidery machine for her 50th birthday, and so she started sewing all kinds of things. And then later, at Christmas time, she came with a great big quilt here, and she said, "Here, Mom," because she'd been working on this thing for like over a year. And she put the Tree of Life in here with the names of all the family, and on the side is the genealogy pieces. So this is my dad, Orland W. Goering, and those are his parents, and then his grandparents on there. So she got all these names of people, and when she got this quilt, that's our family. She put a scripture passage at the bottom and at the top, and she put a big G there and two N's. So this is my husband's side of the family. Johnny Boo, and their Agnes, and all of their great-grandparents. So she's not sure, except now it's at my house. So she doesn't get to look at the quilt to remember them all. It was such a joy. This has just been a wonderful joy. But anyway, we love it. We think it's just an amazing happening.
This is something that I had not heard of before we started accumulating the quilts for the show. These two are buddy quilts. The requirements for buddy quilts is that you have the same pattern and you have the same fabric. But where one quilt has the dark pieces, the other quilt has the light pieces. So they're sort of companion quilts. Friends usually make these to celebrate their friendship. This quilt comes from 1940. It was made when a young woman decided to go into the mission field. She was going to India. Her mother and her sisters put together a quilt to represent all the first cousins they had. You can see it was a huge family. Every block here is the name of one of her first cousins. They put this quilt together. She took it to India with her, and she had it there to remind her of her family when she was gone. This is an example of a modern quilt. For one thing, you can see that the colors are all coordinated and it's the same fabric throughout. That's indicative of the fact that the quilter has bought the fabric. It's new fabric. It's the way a lot of the modern quilts are done. Also, it's a sampler quilt because the quilts, the different blocks are from different designs. That makes it a sampler quilt. This is a special quilt in a number of ways. For one thing, when you have points like that, it's hard to make the points exactly perfect. There is a special piecing technique called paper piecing that helps you make the points exactly pointed so it will look like it's supposed to. This was a special quilt in another way. It belongs to a lady who, the person that made it lives in Georgetown, Kentucky, and about 20 years ago, Toyota made a manufacturing plant in their town, which exploded their population, and some Japanese people moved into town to help with the factory. Some of these Japanese men had wives who quilted, and they became acquainted with the local quilt guild, and eventually the town of Georgetown adopted a sister city in Japan called Tahara. And the quilters in Tahara made connection with the quilters in Georgetown. And the Tahara quilters sent a whole series of patterns of these blocks to the Kentucky quilters so they could make their own blocks. The problem was the patterns that came were all in the metric system. And the Kentucky quilters' rulers and squares were all in the American system. Luckily, they had a gifted mathematician who was part of their quilt guild who spent many, many hours translating the blocks from the metric system to the American system so that the American ladies could sew their quilt. In addition to the blocks that came from Tahara, the maker of this quilt put 2 blocks of her own in. This is a young American girl holding a book. She made a companion Japanese girl with holding a fan. She has her big black hair due and she's wearing a kimono. So those are the 2 cultures represented in this quilt. We have shown you a number of different quilts here. We've tried to cover different patterns, different methods, different purposes for making the quilts, and every quilt we have here is special. We would have liked to show you 2 or 3 times as many, but this is as many as we were able to do. Thank you for joining us.